Ayo, back at it again with another video. Thank you all for watching. I greatly appreciate it. So I haven't done a Ukraine update video in a little bit, so I kind of want to go through the map and kind of give my analysis on kind of what's going on. So not a whole lot of movement along the Dnieper for a long time. There's been a lot of movement in the Donetsk region. So the last time I made a video, the bulge around Kurakove was pretty considerable. It does now look like the Russians have pretty much completely captured Kurakove and its surroundings. This bulge right here does not look good for the Ukrainians. Probably a fighting retreat. Looks like the Russians have made a thrust towards Andriivka and probably moved along some tree lines, some roads in this direction. But yeah, this situation right here, not sustainable for Ukraine at all. Looks like the front line will probably transition to something like this. So if we do the ruler, probably it will transition to something like this. Ukrainians are probably withdrawing out of this area. The Russians are probably going to considerably amp up pressure to take this part of the front line. So it looks like Ukraine is going to have to retreat. Russians are going to continue to push, and the front line is probably going to stabilize around here. The Ukrainians have had minor success in pushing back the Russians around Pischane and Dechenske. The Russians look like they're pushing to try and cut off the road and rail access to the west of Pokrovsk. I do want to talk about this major road junction. So on a map, it doesn't look like it's a big deal, but the fact that Ukraine has now lost this major road junction, that puts Ukrainian troops in around the Pokrovsk region, and especially around this part of the front. The Russians have made a thrust to kind of cut off that road network there. I think that's very critical. I think the Ukrainians definitely need to do everything they can to try and take that road back, because if the Russians are able to continue the thrust in that direction, then that ultimately severs road link from the Pokrovsk direction out towards Toriets, Nelipivka, even out towards places like Chasev Yar. I do think that road on a map doesn't seem too big of a deal, but in my opinion, I do think it's a huge deal, because if the Russians are able to fully press their advantage and continue to take control of that road junction there, then that completely severs the road link from Pokrovsk out towards this other part of the front line, towards Toriets, Dachne, Andriivka, Chasev Yar. So it looks like the Russians are trying to do a pincer movement around Pokrovsk, ultimately flank it from the right, try and flank it from the left, and ultimately just try and force the Ukrainians into a very difficult position around Pokrovsk. So it looks like the Russians are going to continue to press their advantage in this direction. The Russians are going to continue to try and press around Pokrovsk in a two-direction front. I do want to talk about New York, Nelipivka, Torietsk. Looks like the Russians have pretty much wrapped up the control of Torietsk. Obviously, there are still areas that are in the gray zone, but I would consider Torietsk now under Russian control. The situation is not looking good for Ukraine. So according to this map, it looks like Torietsk is now under Russian control, and Ukraine has lost a vital road intersection to the Russian forces, which I do think is a huge deal, especially considering the road from Pavlorad to Pokrovsk and even towards this part of the front around Chasiv Yar and Toretsk. So the situation, in my opinion, looks like the Russians have completely taken Toretsk. The situation around Chasiv Yar doesn't look like there's a whole lot of movement. I mean, it looks like the Russians have probably 50% of Chasiv Yar under their control. I know the canal micro district over this direction. It looks like the Russians have tried to push that way, a little bit of thrust here and there. But honestly, it looks like even Chasiv Yar is another city, town, settlement under Russian control. So the situation's not good around Chasiv Yar. Situation's not good around Toretsk. And the situation's not good around the road junction between Pokrovsk and this other part of the front line. I do want to talk about this part of the line. It looks like the Russians have made some serious progress in this direction. They have continued to kind of push. They're looking like they're trying to push towards Berova, towards the Oskil Reservoir. I still believe the situation around Kupiansk is critical, because if you are a Ukrainian soldier around this Kupiansk bulge, you have the water to your back and you're surrounded by Russian forces on 3 sides. And it looks like the Russians have tried to cross and make some pushes. They might try and push towards Kupiansk along this roadway. So that would further jeopardize Kupiansk as a whole. The Russians have made pushes towards Berova. It looks like the Russians have tried to push towards Liman in this direction over here. You know, this territory is still under Ukrainian control, but if the Russians are able to continue to push in this direction, a little bit here, a little bit there, then that could definitely put this part of the front in jeopardy, especially around Berova and the Oskil Reservoir. I do think the situation around Kupiansk is critical. It's not a good situation for Ukraine to be in, especially if you are a soldier there. You're surrounded on 3 sides by Russian forces and water to your rear. So not a whole lot of movement around Volchansk. I don't believe there's a whole lot of movement in the Kursk direction. So it looks like the only ways that the line is moving, it looks like the Russians are trying to make a concerted thrust around Pokrovsk in multiple directions. They're trying to seal off Korakova and its surroundings, ultimately try and push along this roadway, try and force its way towards Udachne, and looks like the Russians are trying to make a thrust to cut off the road to the west of Pokrovsk. So basically, the moral of the story in this update: Ukraine loses a vital road intersection. There looks like Toretsk is more or less under Russian control, and also it looks like Chasiv Yar is also mostly under Russian control. So that's pretty much the update. There's not a whole lot of movement around the line in other directions. So basically, it looks like the only major things the Russians have left to try and take control of the Donbass is Pokrovsk, and then ultimately focus on the Oskil Reservoir, and then take their attention towards Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. So that's kind of the update on that front. Not a whole lot of movement over here, a lot of movement in and around here, and very little movement over here, with not a whole lot of movement over here. So that is kind of how I see the Ukrainian map at the moment. So with that, that's the end of the video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Deuces.